Good morning. This meeting will come to order. This is a public meeting of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission to consider final and proposed rules under the Dodd-Frank Act. I'd like to welcome members of the public and market participants and members of the media, as well as those listening to the meeting on the phone or watching this webcast. I'd also like to thank Commissioners Summers, Chilton, O'Malley, and Weegan for their significant contribution to the rule writing process, and thank the CFTC's hardworking and dedicated staff. In 2008, the swaps market helped concentrate risk in the financial system that then spilled out over the real economy, affecting businesses and customers across the country. And as we know, 8 million Americans lost their jobs, and thousands of small businesses were lost as a result of the crisis. The derivatives reforms in the Dodd-Frank Act, once implemented, will lead to significant benefits for the real economy, that which makes up over 94% of private sector jobs in America. The derivatives reforms also will bring significant benefit to all Americans who depend on pension funds, mutual funds, community banks, and insurance companies, as that part of the financial system will benefit greatly from the greater transparency and lower risk in the swaps market. They'll benefit from the transparency and lowering risk that also comes from this 24th meeting of the Dodd-Frank reforms. We will consider rules addressing both lowering risk and promoting transparency. To lower risk, we'll consider business conduct standards for swap dealers and major swap participants, what we've come to call internal business conduct rules, and I thank Frank and Ward that are going to present initially on that. And then to promote greater transparency, we will consider a proposal of the block rule. Last month, the CFTC completed some of its first rules or reforms related to dealers. The Commission finished up on a registration rule that for the first time regulators will be able to monitor swap dealers and major swap participants. And we also finished up on rules establishing robust sales practices in the swaps market. Today's internal business conduct rule, a collection actually of 5 proposals from, I guess Frank will tell us, about a year to a year and a half ago, builds on this progress. It requires swap dealers and major swaps participants to establish risk management policies to manage the risks of their swaps activities. It requires firewalls to protect against conflicts of interest between trading and research and between trading and clearing units of financial firms. In addition, the rule establishes reporting and record-keeping and daily trading records, critically to ensure that there's an audit trail that details the full trading history. These provisions were congressionally mandated. In addition, swap dealers and major swap participants and futures commission merchants must have a chief compliance officer and a compliance program in place to ensure compliance with the provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act to protect the public. In addition, today we're going to be considering a proposal, or one might say a re-proposal, of a block rule. This proposal benefits from significant comments we received on real-time public reporting proposal, which also included something on blocks. The new methodology in this re-proposal makes a number of significant changes from the earlier proposal. First, it's tailored so that it includes block sizes that vary by asset class. I think, for instance, there'll be 24 separate pieces of the interest rate market, and it will be tailored by underlying reference product or rate. Second, it's been simplified, as it will no longer rely on a test which came to be called the social size multiple test for setting minimum block size. I think though it's more tailored and more buckets, it's actually far more simple. Third, the proposal moves from being based on transaction counts to being based on net notional amount of swaps within a category. And furthermore, this new proposal benefits from a review of a significant amount of market data, particularly in the interest rate and credit swaps market. As I've said for quite some time, we're working to complete these rules in a thoughtful, balanced way, not against a clock. We've finalized to date 27 rules, and if we move forward today, it would be 28 rules, but we have much to do going forward. And though we've made great progress on the congressionally mandated reforms to bring transparency and competition to these markets to best protect taxpayers and lower risk and the rest of the economy, it's only going to be with finalizing the rules, and I would say also with much-needed funding for 2013 that we're going to be able to actually oversee these markets and help protect the public. But I have great confidence in the Commission and the staff that will finish the remaining reforms this year for the benefit of the market. I'd also just want to take a moment to announce a two-day roundtable that we're having here next week. The staff is going to be hosting next Wednesday and Thursday, which will look at the critical issues surrounding further enhancements to customer protection. Segregation of customer funds is a core foundation of customer protection in both the futures and the swaps markets. We've already taken a number of steps, such as enhancing the protections regarding investment of customer funds through amendments to what we call Rule 1.25, and the requirement that future commission merchants and derivatives clearing organizations to segregate customer collateral supporting cleared swaps, ensuring customer money is protected individually all the way down to the clearinghouse, what we've so-called LSOC for swaps. But there's much more that these panels and the public can weigh in on. Panels will include looking at alternative custodial arrangements for segregated funds, enhanced customer protections and transparency provisions for futures commission merchants, additional protections for collateral possibly in the futures markets, revisions to bankruptcy rules, so-called Part 190, protection of customer funds trading in foreign futures markets, or what we call Part 30, and issues associated with entities duly registered with the CFTC as FCMs and the SEC as broker-dealers, and we've invited the Securities and Exchange Commission staff to partake in any part of these 2 days, and also looking at possible enhancements to the self-regulatory structure either here or at the SROs themselves. Before we hear from staff, I'm going to turn it over to fellow commissioners. Commissioner Summers.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the staff who have put a tremendous amount of time and effort into formulating the rules that we are voting on today. The final business conduct rules and the proposal for establishing appropriate minimum block sizes for swaps. The challenges we face in implementing the Dodd-Frank Act are ongoing, and I cannot emphasize enough how proud I am to be part of an organization that is filled with such dedicated public servants, because it takes a lot of time and effort to get these rules into the place where we're considering them today. And I want to again say how much I appreciate the work of all the teams. While I appreciate the hard work that has gone into finalizing the business conduct rules, I unfortunately cannot support the final product. There are too many provisions in the final rules that don't make sense or portend disturbing trends, and I'll point out just a few examples. During the course of the comment period, the Commission received requests to allow substituted compliance for entities subject to comparable regulation by a prudential regulator. This makes perfect sense to me from both a resource and policy perspective. If a registrant is subject to comparable regulation, why do we need to layer on additional regulation? And given our own strained resources and the additional burdens that duplicative regulation places on registrants, shouldn't we be looking for ways to rely on our fellow regulators whenever we can? Instead, the Commission has, quote, determined that its interest in ensuring that all registrants are subject to consistent regulation outweighs any burden that may be placed on registrants that are subject to regulation by a prudential regulator. This is form over substance, a cookie-cutter approach that we can ill afford at a time when our resources have been stretched as never before. It also does not bode well for how the Commission may be approaching extraterritoriality issues. While we have been hearing for months that staff has been developing guidance on the application of Dodd-Frank to activities outside the U.S., nothing of substance has been shared with my office to date. Given the Commission's unwillingness to rely on comparable regulation by a U.S. prudential regulator, I am left wondering whether we will be abandoning our long-standing policy of recognizing and relying on comparable foreign regulators. I hope the answer to that question is no. Another provision of the final rules that baffles me is the requirement that swap dealers and major swap participants diligently investigate the adequacy of the financial resources and risk management procedures of any central counterparty through which the registrant clears. Given the extensive, detailed regulations the Commission recently finalized for derivative clearing organizations on financial resources and risk management procedures, any DCO that accepts a swap for clearing presumably will not do so unless it has the proper resources and risk management procedures in place. The preamble to the rule states, however, that a determination that a DCO is in compliance with the Commission's core principles and regulations is no substitute for the due diligence of registrants who must evaluate the use of a central counterparty in light of their own circumstances. This begs the question: what is the registrant supposed to do independently to satisfy itself that a DCO has sufficient resources and procedures to clear a particular swap that it accepts for clearing? Can a registrant refuse to clear a swap that the Commission has determined must be cleared because the registrant has determined that no DCO that accepts the swap for clearing is truly up to the task, given the registrant's particular circumstances? The preamble also states that swap dealers and major swap participants may voluntarily elect to clear swaps that are not required to be cleared through CCPs that are not registered with the Commission. And in those instances, some sort of due diligence prior to submitting a swap for clearing would be part of a prudent risk management program. While this makes slightly more sense, I am again left wondering whether we are signaling something about the extraterritorial application of our rules. Do we contemplate allowing U.S. swap dealers to voluntarily clear through foreign CCPs? If so, under what circumstances will that be allowed? I am most disturbed, however, by the walls we are erecting on the communications between the trading and clearing units of swap dealers and affiliated FCMs. The only exception we allow is for communications necessary to manage a default. The statute requires swap dealers to establish safeguards to ensure that interactions between trading and clearing personnel do not contravene the provisions of the Act requiring open access to clearing. In typical fashion, our rules go far beyond the intent of the statute and prevent any communication between a swap dealer and an affiliated FCM that would incentivize or encourage the use of an affiliated FCM for clearing. We seem to be worried that a customer's clearing choices will be narrowed if a multi-service financial institution offers options based on bundled or non-bundled services. The end effect of the rules, however, is to restrict a customer's access to information upon which to make an informed choice. Rather than protecting customers, I fear the rules will increase their costs and create needless inefficiencies for those looking for full-service options. With regard to the block trading proposal, I really appreciate the hard work the team has put into coming up with a practical solution to a very challenging problem. Dodd-Frank mandates that the Commission specify the criteria for determining what constitutes a large notional swap transaction for particular markets and contracts. In determining appropriate block sizes, Congress has directed that we take into account whether public disclosure of transactions will reduce market liquidity. This requires a balancing act. If the block threshold is set too low, there will be reduced transparency in the market. If the block threshold is set too high, there will be reduced liquidity in the market. It is no small task to come up with a solution to this complex problem. I believe it is worth noting that we have been grappling with the concept of appropriate block size and market transparency in the futures markets for years. In July of 2004, we proposed guidance on, among other things, DCM block trading rules. We re-proposed again in 2008 and again in 2010. Setting block sizes for swaps is not an easy task, and absent robust data, comprehensive analysis, and the benefit of market experience, we could severely harm liquidity at this critical regulatory juncture where we seek to bring more swaps onto CEFs. Under the current proposal, which recommends utilizing a 67% notional amount calculation, only the largest 6% of all IRS and CDS would be blocks. This proposal ignores Congress's mandate that we take into account the impact of public disclosure on liquidity. We are effectively sacrificing liquidity at the altar of transparency. While I applaud the rule team's efforts to analyze available data in the interest rate and credit asset classes, the team only had access to 3 months' worth of transaction data, and that data dates back to the summer of 2010. We are relying on stale data and far too little of it. Absent further transaction data, it is hard to say if the 6% relationship would even hold true over a larger transaction data set. Of greater concern to me is the one-size-fits-all approach in which we blindly apply the 67% formula across asset classes. I do not believe this is prudent given the potential variations in liquidity among the asset classes. The one ray of light that I do see in this proposal is that the team has gone to great lengths to pose numerous questions and to put out myriad alternative approaches. If we're going to get this right in the final rule, we need to be willing to consider all the comments from the industry. With regard to comments from the industry, I am also concerned that as we are working to finalize the rules which will implement Dodd-Frank, I believe it's the most important role I've ever played as a commissioner at the CFTC. And I believe that it is crucial for the marketplace and for market participants that we get these rules right and that we finalize them in a way that is reasonable and that will give these rules the ability to stand the test of time. These rules should not only reflect input from the majority, but from the commission as a whole, and these rules do not do that. We consistently reject reasoned comments from industry professionals with little justification in our cost-benefit analysis to support those rejections. I have been hopeful for the past year that things would change when we started finalizing these rules, and especially the rules that are so integral to the new regulatory framework. But things have not changed. I am no longer optimistic. I do not believe that these rules have a chance of withstanding the test of time, but I believe instead that this commission will be consumed over the next few years using our valuable resources to rewrite the rules that we knew or should have known would not work because the public commented and told us that. We should have known it when we issued them, and we instead are issuing them without taking sufficient comments into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Summers. Commissioner Chilton.
Thank you. I also thank the staff, and I support the rules, both the proposal and the rule. And after Commissioner Summers speaks, I usually take some of the things she said and talk about how insightful they are and helpful they are. And I think there are some things in there, Jill, that are really good to learn from. And on the block thing, I mean, this is a proposal. Just a proposal. We're going to have to listen to the comments. We messed up on the last proposal, and so here we have another one. But I agree with Commissioner Summers on the balancing part of it. I was reminded recently of a talk I gave a couple and a half years ago called Sense of Balance. And in it, I talked about the flying Wallendas, Carl Wallenda, the trapeze and the High Wire Act, used to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show. And for those of you who have no clue what I'm talking about, this is classic entertainment heritage. I go Google it. That's what the internet's for. But as we do these rules, and as Commissioner Summers is talking about, as they get more complex and one's layered upon the other, it gets higher, the safety net needs to be better, and our balance needs to be better. And we need to look at these things in concert. And the block trading rule is one example where you can't just look at it in isolation. So you need to look at the reporting rule, along with the block rule, and you need to look at the CEF rule. So Section 733 says, as a rule of construction regarding CEFs, that there are two things we need to do in promulgating our rules. One is promote CEFs, promote trading on CEFs, and the second is to promote pre-trade, price transparency. So if we set the blocks too low in the block trading rule, we wouldn't be promoting trading on CEFs because the blocks can be traded off of CEFs. So we wouldn't be doing that first rule of construction. But with regard to pre-trade price transparency, if we set the levels too high, the result is what we'll end up doing is there'll be some institutions who won't want to use this risk management tool at all. Because if they have to report these very large trades instantaneously, immediately, they won't be able to lay off their risk. And therefore, they won't do it. And ultimately, that could theoretically impact the prices that consumers pay. So, Dodd-Frank isn't about not having us involved in risk management. That's not the goal. We want risk management. We just want the transparency. We want the accountability. So it's all about balance. And I think we also reached the balance on a good balance, a good equilibrium on the internal conflicts rule. Look, you can pick up the paper any day, watch television any day, and read about all the problems in the business world. I'm not talking about specifically the industry that we regulate, but sort of the conflict-ridden, insidious nature of business in society today. The American public is just sort of fed up with it. So I think the rule on internal conflicts that we've proposed strikes the right balance. It essentially sets up sort of a good housekeeping standards for everybody to operate by, which allows them to continue to do risk management, allows them to be involved, appropriately addresses conflicts of interest, and in addition to spelling out the duties and responsibilities of the people at these firms. Finally, there's an issue that I've sort of been biting my tongue on lately, and it's one that I've talked about a lot, and that's position limits. And we're not dealing with it today, but I continue to be concerned about it. We passed this rule final rule on position limits in October, and the deal is, for those of you who don't know, is that the clock didn't start ticking on implementation of position limits until we get this joint rulemaking on the definitions rule, which includes definition of 9 different products. One of them is swaps. So once we define what a swap is, 14 months after that, we can start having position limits on swaps. So it made sense to wait till we had this rule. And the chairman has worked hard on trying to work with our colleagues over at our sister agency, the SEC, to move forward on these things. But as we know today, because on the entities definition rule, we got pushed back. So doing a joint rule with 2 agencies is always a challenge. And in this case, we thought we were going to get to an agreement in December. We thought we were going to get to an agreement in January. Here it is February, and we're looking at maybe April. If we did it in April, there'd be 60 days until the regulated exchanges would have the limits in the spot, the federal limits in the spot and the deferred months. So this is a tool that we need now. There is a chart, and I won't mention the company, but there's a chart here, and I know people can't see it, but a meeting we had yesterday, and it spelled out where the rules were going to come down and what this company envisioned as when things would be implemented. And the last thing here, of all of the rules, position limits. Now, it's ironic because Congress told us that position limits was one of the first things that we should do. But here, it's the last thing to get done on this chart. Now, I hope that's wrong. But to the extent that we can work, Mr. Chairman, to try and figure out a way forward that doesn't result in us just being sort of hamstrung, whether or not it's going forward with an interim final rule that just went forward, maybe using our existing authority on the regulated exchanges with limits. Again, limits that exist in the ag and the spot month, exist in the spot month for everything, the 28 designated commodities, but exist in the ags and have for decades. Or whether or not there's a way that the lawyers can work with the actual swaps definition. Forget about all the other definitions, all the other 8 definitions, but really just focus in on the swaps definition so we can approve that, and then we can have position limits. I mean, this is a tool that can help consumers. It can help consumers now. So I hope, like Carl Wallenda, we take this good position limits rule that's balanced very fairly, but get it to the other end of the wire.
Thank you, Commissioner Chilton. If I might just say, on the working with the SEC, it's been a very constructive relationship, a partnership these last 2.5, 3 years. But yes, Congress asked us to work together on a joint role on further defining swap dealer, securities-based swap dealer, swap, and as you said, 9 terms. It continues to be that we'll take these rules up when they're ready. The entity definition rule, hopefully very shortly. I think when you were referring to April, that's what we were talking about on the products definition rule. But I, too, like you, have been a supporter of, maybe not as vocal, but a supporter of position limits. And so I look forward to working with your staff on any ideas that you have. But in the meantime, what we're doing in the Office of Chief Economist, Office of General Counsel, Division of Market Oversight folks have really been engaged with the similar folks over at the SEC on both of these rule sets. But of course, we're only going to do them when we get them right and when it's got the input from 10 commissioners. So, Commissioner Amalia.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to, before I get to my statement, comment on the roundtables. I think those are important. We don't have an agenda. You kind of laid it out today, but maybe we can have a little discussion. How much information are you going to give the public to inform this discussion on the issues? I mean, I know we've talked about some of the reforms, but how are they going to know what to comment on?
It's being run by the people you know. I mean, Bob Wasserman and Laura Estrada, and then over with Gary Barnett and Amanda O'Lear and Frank and so forth, and Tom Smith. I'm sure there are others too. But so I think that they've been reaching out to your office and everybody's office to get input on the panels, the panelists. I mean, I don't normally personally get involved in who's on the panels and so forth. But I think that, if I wanted Gary, why don't you make sure, I see Gary Barnett, and I don't see, oh, there's Ananda. Why don't you make sure to inform the commissioners today on the answer to this question, how the public will know what questions you all are seeking input on these 7 panels. And then, I assume that today you'll put up on the website an agenda. So they'll put an agenda up today on the website, but then also to Commissioner Amalia's question of how the public will know what questions you're going to be asking.
That would be very helpful. Thank you. The latest issue of The Economist featured an article entitled "Overregulated America." That features in its archetype for the excessive and badly written rules our own Dodd-Frank Act. The problem the article points out is that the rules sound reasonable, but impose a huge collective burden due to their complexity. Part of the problem, as The Economist points out, is that we are under the impression that we can anticipate and regulate for every eventuality. Throughout the rulemaking process, I've argued that we must ensure that regulations are accessible, consistent, written in plain language, and guided by empirical data, and that we follow the President's 2011 guidance in his Executive Order 13563 to develop responsible cost-benefit analysis. I accept wholeheartedly the mission put upon this administration by the President to, quote, root out regulations that conflict, that are not worth the cost, or that are just plain dumb, end quote. Today, in furtherance of his guidance and that mission, I will not support the final rules governing the internal business conduct standards or the block trading rule. The Commission has an obligation to make a determination whether our rules qualify as a major rule, and the OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs has concurred with our determination that this set of rules qualifies as a, quote, major rule under the Congressional Review Act with an annual effect on the economy of more than $100 million. However, there isn't a single list of costs associated with the internal rule to make a determination whether that figure is correct or not. Cost-benefit analysis of this rule clearly fails to comply with the OMB Circular A4, which is the how-to manual for government best practices in developing cost-benefit analysis. Our rule fails to discuss anticipated costs. There is no analysis based on reasoned assumptions or an evaluation of the impacts of the rulemaking. We have selected our own baseline to measure costs and have failed to use the pre-statutory baseline in direct violation of the OMB guidance. This rule amounts to regulatory malpractice. After reviewing the internal business conduct rules, I have reached the tipping point and can no longer tolerate the application of weak standards in analyzing the costs and the benefits of our rulemakings. Our inability to develop quantitative analysis or develop reasonable comparative analysis of legitimate options hurts the credibility of this Commission and undermines the quality of our rules. I believe it is time for professional help, and I will be following up this statement with a letter to the Director of the OMB seeking review of the internal business conduct rules to determine whether or not the rulemaking complies with the President's executive orders and the OMB guidance found in OMB Circular A4. The fact that the Commission has been challenged by weak economic analysis is not new. In fact, the CFTC's IG raised many concerns with our analysis in the June 13, 2011 review. I believe the Commission began to stray from the President's executive order as a result of staff guidance, which was Exhibit 2 in the IG report. The document is intended to guide staff in developing cost-benefit analysis. Unfortunately, it weakens OMB guidance in a number of areas. For example, quote, it directs the staff to, quote, incorporate the principles of Executive Order 13563 to the extent that they are consistent with 5A and that it is reasonably feasible to do so. I'm not sure that the President had that in mind when he issued the order. As for the executive order, it appears that we will incorporate their principles only when they neatly align with our own interpretation. Setting the bar this low is remarkable. Indeed, former CFTC Commissioner and Acting Chairman William Albrecht recently wrote that expecting any detailed cost-benefit analysis of the proposed Dodd-Frank rules is impossible, in part because, quote, the CFTC has never had to develop CBA expertise, end quote. Additionally, as in today's final rulemaking, the Commission has determined, in contradiction of OMB guidance, that it may set the baseline to incorporate the costs of statutorily mandated rulemakings, regardless of how the CFTC has interpreted the statutory goals and regardless of the existence of alternative means to comply with such goals. Thereby, the Commission is relying on an arbitrary presumption that, quote, from the rule, to the extent that new regulations reflect the statutory requirements of the Dodd-Frank Act, they will not create costs and benefits beyond those resulting from Congress's own statutory mandates in the Dodd-Frank Act, end quote. This is unacceptable, and that the Commission ignores the pre-Dodd-Frank reality and establishes its own economic baseline for its rulemaking is unacceptable. The practice defies not only common sense, but rigorous and competent economic analysis as well. OMB Circular A4 is very specific about cost-benefit best practices. The circular also directs the Commission to consider alternatives available, quote, for the key attributes or provisions of the rule, end quote. The circular goes on to recommend, quote, it is not adequate simply to report a comparison of an agency's preferred option to choose a baseline. Whenever you report the benefits and costs of alternative options, you should present both total and incremental costs and benefits, end quote. This is at the most basic level of the analysis where the Commission has failed to provide alternative options for consideration or failed to justify its choice of regulation with a specific cost-benefit analysis. There are multiple examples where concerns raised by commenters were dismissed out of hand without any cost analysis or alternative comparisons provided. However, I'd like to share one example which I found to be the most absurd, and it relates to the duplicative requirement to store trade data that is already stored by an SDR. Our rule in the cost-benefit analysis states, quote, "The Commission considered this alternative to its record-keeping rules, but determined that it is premature at this time to permit swap dealers and MSPs to rely solely on SDRs to meet their record-keeping obligations under the rules. At present, SDRs are new entities under Dodd-Frank Act with no track record of operations, and for particular swap asset classes, SDRs have yet to be established," end quote, which is just astounding since we've already voted on this, create the gold standard for data retention and passing various rules regarding swap data repositories. I am stunned at this comment, which seems to undermine all of our previous 3 rules on data, swap data core principles, and real-time reporting. In addition to finalizing rules governing registration standards, duties, and core principles for SDRs, the Commission has already voted on the final rules to establish and compel the reporting of swaps transaction information to SDRs for purposes of real-time reporting, and to ensure that the complete data concerning swaps is available to regulators throughout the existence of the swaps and for 15 years following termination. It is curious as to how the Commission came to the conclusion that in the internal business conduct rules that these are cost effective, given that they require firms to keep duplicative and redundant trade records when all trades must be reported to an SDR, and including 10 years longer than held by the registrants. I have serious concerns about the Commission's ability to monitor and reconcile 2 sets of records, which is the rationale put forth in this rule. Trade repositories are intended to enhance swap market transparency. The Commission should do more to ensure its own transparency with regard to its cost-benefit analysis by disclosing its own assumptions and data to support its conclusions. Again, I go back to Circular A4, which outlines the standards of transparency with the following direction. Quote, "A good analysis should be transparent and your results must be reproducible. You should clearly set out the basic assumptions, methods, and data underlying the analysis and discuss uncertainties associated with your estimates," end quote. Goes on to recommend that, quote, "To provide greater access to your analysis, you should generally post it with the supporting documents on the internet so the public can review the findings," end quote. Not aware the Commission will comply with either guidance. I believe that our reasonably feasible standard, as articulated in our own staff guidance, has caused us to miss the mark for identifying using the best, most innovative, and least burdensome tools to meet the regulatory ends laid out in Section 4S of the Commodity Exchange Act. I agree with Chairman Albrecht that the CFTC ought to be able to require to undertake a more rigorous cost-benefit analysis. I will be sending a letter to Acting OMB Director Jeff Zients requesting his assistance in determining how far off the baseline of the Commission has fallen. If OMB Circular A4 means anything at all, then OMB should take action and hold the Commission to the circular standards. With regard to the block rule, I have a complete statement that I would like to have included in the record. To summarize my concern, I am frustrated that this rule proposal changed significantly last night, moving the block size from 50% of notional value to 67%. Amazingly, this did not affect our cost-benefit analysis. This new proposal looks a lot like our original proposal. Instead of capturing 95% of trades, this proposal now will only capture 93%, albeit with different metrics. I don't agree with the one-size-fits-all approach, and I hope we will consider the final rule a more nuanced asset-specific solution based on actual transaction data. I would like to thank the rule teams for their hard work in answering my questions regarding their work and the patience in explaining their complex rules. They've done a remarkable job to respond to the shifting dynamics, and these are massive, complex rules, and I greatly appreciate the work they've put into them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Malia. Commissioner Wiegand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be supporting the staff's recommendations on the business conduct rules and the block trade proposal before us today. There are many aspects to the final rule concerning internal business conduct standards for FCMs, introducing brokers, swap dealers, and major swap participants, which now consists of 5 prior proposals. For now, I want to focus on the conflicts of interest requirements and the qualification and designation of a chief compliance officer. Our clearing-related conflicts rules seek to promote customer choice and clearing independence in the swaps markets. Swap users will be best served if they have a range of choices for their clearing needs. Toward this end, the rule requires targeted firewalls to ensure that trading unit personnel do not interfere with or improperly influence clearing-related decisions by affiliates. Importantly, the rule does not prohibit legitimate interaction between business units, including coordination in the event of a default. I also appreciate the staff's efforts to modify the rules so it strikes a better balance in preventing uncompetitive behavior while permitting affiliates to meet customer needs. To be sure, customer protection should not end at clearing. Indeed, recent events in the FCM community suggest that the warnings of a risk or compliance officer may be quickly dampened by others with P&L responsibilities or other incentives to do so. This is why I support the requirement that the compliance officer have an independent line directly to the board of directors. Given the persistent resource constraints on the Commission, it is unlikely that we alone can ensure full compliance with all swaps-related regulations at all times. Empowering and protecting the independence of the compliance officer are therefore essential components of our compliance regime. The new large notional and block trade proposal builds upon our real-time reporting rules proposed in December 2010. It sets forth possible methodologies for determining block thresholds in the 4 major swap categories, as well as tenor buckets within these categories. It also requests public comment not only on the appropriateness of the final thresholds, but also on the best method for reaching them. In considering this proposal, the Commission is again faced with the potentially conflicting objectives of promoting transparency and protecting liquidity. A number of my fellow commissioners mentioned the same issue in their remarks. Congress itself recognized this potential conflict and therefore directed the Commission to protect liquidity through block thresholds for public reporting and execution purposes. On the one hand, the public benefits from appropriate block trading thresholds because liquidity providers are given a window of time to assume and lay off risks in what can be relatively illiquid markets. If these liquidity providers are not given time to do so, the execution and inventory risks associated with large transactions may result in increased costs for commercial end users who depend on the markets. On the other hand, if we set block thresholds too low and liquidity providers are able to hide their trading interest for longer than needed to hedge out of their positions, then public pricing in these markets will not reflect economic reality. This would provide unfair execution and informational advantages to large market participants over others. Accordingly, the Commission is attempting to take a measured approach to the block trade issue, providing for methodologies that are tailored to specific asset classes should result in block thresholds that better balance transparency and liquidity. Yet I recognize this methodology could have flaws. It may result in thresholds that are too high or too low in swap categories or tenor buckets with abnormal transaction distributions. I therefore encourage the public to comment on the potential challenges of our methodologies and suggest alternative approaches as well if better ones exist. I am also interested in receiving public feedback concerning block transactions in the other commodity asset class. The Commission proposes certain block thresholds based on those applicable to economically related futures contracts. I am aware of differences in liquidity of these two markets and the concern that the block trade rule could inadvertently create arbitrage opportunities. I worry that the Commission's swap-related determinations could be improperly informed by the liquidity of the futures markets. I look forward to comments concerning this question and whether this approach could unfairly disadvantage certain marketplaces. I am hopeful that with public input, the Commission will be able to craft a methodology that uses order data in a way that yields a useful measure of liquidity. If the theoretical justification of block trading turns in part on execution risks, then available liquidity within a reasonable distance of the mid-market price may be a relevant consideration in crafting our final thresholds. As the markets develop, we should remain open to other ideas and methodologies, even as we implement final thresholds. Additionally, the Commission's final block rules must address the interaction of the related CEF, reporting, and execution methods rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Weechen. And now, Frank and Ward, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I would like to thank the members of the rulemaking team for all of their hard work and dedication in completing this set of final rules. Staff is recommending for the Commission's consideration final rules comprising the first cluster of internal business conduct standards for SDs and MSPs, as well as final rules for conflicts of interest policies and procedures for FCMs and IBs, and Chief Compliance Officer requirements for FCMs, SDs, and MSPs. The final rules in this cluster for SDs and MSPs cover risk management, monitoring of position limits, diligent supervision, business continuity and disaster recovery, conflict of interest policies and procedures for information firewalls between research and trading and clearing activities, availability of information for disclosure and inspection, record keeping and daily trading records, and designation of a chief compliance officer and the requirements for an annual compliance report. These final rules implement certain requirements of Sections 4D and 4S of the Commodity Exchange Act as added or amended by Sections 731 and 732 of the Dodd-Frank Act. Pursuant to Section 4SJ of the CEA, the risk management final rule requires swap dealers and major swap participants to establish a risk management program consisting of written policies and procedures designed to monitor and manage the risks associated with their swaps activities. Under the final rule, the risk management program must take into account, among other things, market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, foreign currency risk, legal risk, operational risk, settlement risk, and the risk related to trading and traders. The rule also requires risk management issues to be elevated to management through periodic risk exposure reports. The risk management provisions also require SDs and MSPs to establish business continuity and disaster recovery plans designed to enable them to resume operations by the next business day following an emergency or other disruption. Also pursuant to Section 4SJ of the CEA, the position limits monitoring rule requires swap dealers and major swap participants to establish procedures to monitor for and prevent violations of applicable position limits established by the Commission, a designated contract market, or a swap execution facility. A swap dealer or major swap participant is required to provide annual trading for personnel on position limits, diligently monitor and supervise trading, implement an early warning system, test their position limit procedures, document compliance with position limits on a quarterly basis, and audit the procedures annually. Pursuant to Section 4SH of the CEA, the diligent supervision final rule requires each swap dealer and major swap participant to establish a system of diligent supervision over all activities performed by its partners, members, officers, employees, and agents, and requires SDs and MSPs to establish a supervisory system and appoint qualified supervisory personnel. The final rules also implement requirements under Section 4SJ of the CEA for swap dealers and major swap participants to promptly disclose all information required by the Commission or a prudential regulator. To ensure prompt disclosure of all information, swap dealers and major swap participants are required to have adequate internal systems that will permit the Commission to obtain any information required in a timely manner. The final rules on conflicts of interest for SDs, MSPs, FCMs, and IBs, as has been mentioned, implement requirements under Section 4SJ and 4DC of the CEA. Under these final rules, these registrants are required to prevent conflicts of interest by establishing appropriate information firewalls between persons researching or analyzing the price or market for any derivative and persons involved in pricing, trading, or clearing activities, as well as between persons acting in a role of providing clearing activities or making determinations as to accepting clearing customers, and persons involved in pricing or trading activities. The final rules prohibit non-research personnel from directing the views expressed in research reports and prohibit the supervision of research analysts by certain trading and clearing personnel, including decisions related to research analyst compensation. The final rules also prohibit registrants from offering favorable research or threatening to change research for existing or prospective counterparties in exchange for business or compensation, and require disclosure of financial interests of research analysts that may pose a conflict of interest in research reports and public appearances. With respect to clearing activities, the final rules prohibit swap dealers or major swap participants from interfering with or attempting to influence decisions related to the provision of clearing or the acceptance of clearing customers of an affiliated FCM. Swap dealers and major swap participants also must maintain appropriate partitions between business trading personnel and clearing personnel of an affiliated clearing member. As required by Sections 4DD and 4SK of the CEA, the final Chief Compliance Officer rule for SDs, MSPs, and FCMs require these registrants to designate a qualified CCO. The CCO must report directly to the board or to the senior officer of the registrant, administer the registrant's compliance policies reasonably designed to ensure compliance with the CEA and Commission regulations, resolve conflicts of interest in consultation with the board or senior officer, and establish procedures for the remediation of non-compliance issues. The final rule also requires that the CCO prepare and sign an annual report that contains a description of the registrant's compliance policies and its compliance with the CEA and Commission regulations, including a description of any material non-compliance issues. Either the CCO or the CEO of the registrant must certify the annual report as accurate and complete to the best of his or her knowledge and reasonable belief. Finally, pursuant to Section 4SF of the CEA, the final record-keeping rule for SDs and MSPs requires these registrants to keep full and complete transaction and position information for their swaps activities, including all documents on which trade information is originally recorded. Transaction records would be required to be maintained in a manner that is identifiable and searchable by transaction and by counterparty. The final rules also require that swap dealers and major swap participants keep basic business records, including, among other things, minutes from board meetings, organizational charts, audit documentation, records of marketing materials, and complaints. Finally, swap dealers and major swap participants would be required to maintain records of information required to be submitted to a swap data repository or to be reported on a real-time public basis under those rules. The daily trading records rule, pursuant to 4SG of the CEA, prescribe daily trading records requirements, including records of trade information related to pre-execution, execution, and post-execution data. Pre-execution trade data would include records of all oral and written communications that lead to the execution of a swap. The rules require swap dealers and major swap participants to ensure that they preserve all information necessary to conduct a comprehensive and accurate trade reconstruction for each swap. Under the final rules, records of related cash or forward transactions must be kept when those transactions are used to hedge, mitigate the risk of, or offset any swap held by the swap dealer or major swap participant as required under Section 4SG of the CEA. Records required to be maintained under these final rules must be kept in accordance with existing Commission Rule 1.31, with the exception of records of or related to swap transactions, which would be retained until the termination, expiration, or maturity of the transaction and for 5 years thereafter. A further exception is made for records of oral communications or recordings of oral communications, which are required to be kept for a period of 1 year. Rules regarding reports. With respect to reporting, the final reporting rules require swap dealers and major swap participants to report their swaps in accordance with the real-time public reporting rules and swap data rules finalized by the Commission in January of this year. This concludes my prepared remarks, and I would be happy to address any questions the Commission may have.
The chair will now entertain a motion to accept the staff recommendation concerning this final rule.
So moved.
Second.
I thank you. I support the internal business conduct rule, which I think does lower risk that swap dealers may pose to the rest of the economy. These rules, I think, are a direct result of critical reform of Dodd-Frank Act, and leads to my first question, Frank or Ward. Did Congress direct us to write rules in these various areas, call it, 4S, F, G, H, J? I can't remember all the letters, but.
Yes, each of these rules is pursuant to part of 4S, or for the FCMs and IBs, part of 4D.
So Congress used the word shall or may?
In each of these areas? each of these were determined to be, other than in a couple of instances, non-discretionary.
Non-discretionary, so shall. See, I think that Congress debated quite at length jurisdictional issues about who should do it, and they arrived at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission because this commission has such a wealth of experience in derivatives, though it was in futures rather than swaps, but also debated whether it was important to have robust duties, risk management, record keeping, daily trading records, plus an audit trail, and firewalls to address conflicts of interest. And I think that this collection of what was 5 proposals greatly benefited from public comment, greatly benefited where we could to make adjustments, but also to fulfill the congressional mandate. The final rule establishes a number of duties. I'm just going to highlight, I think, just one of them that's, I think, quite critical, is that the swap dealers will have risk management programs with policies and procedures to manage and monitor the risk associated with their activities. This is to ensure that the risk management programs take into consideration various market, credit, liquidity, and other risks. Having spent a little time around this topic from the 1990s, I think it's one of the core assumptions at that period of time is, well, somebody's regulating these entities. There doesn't need to be, Congress didn't need to speak to it. In fact, that was part of the assumptions that went into the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which basically said this agency wouldn't have any role in much of this work. I think that was a false assumption, and I will even say I was part of that assumption. And that is why I am so happy today to be able to support this rule, that this agency does have a role, and Congress asked us to do it, in fact, directed us to do it directly, to write rules about risk management for swap dealers. Another question I have, how much consultation have you had with the Federal Reserve, the bank regulators on these rules?
Each of those agencies has viewed both the proposal, the comment summaries, the first draft of the final rules, and the final draft of the final rules.
And though you may not have taken every one of their comments, have you done your best to take most of their comments?
We have addressed all of their major concerns.
All of their major concerns. So it's a collaborative approach, but I think Congress sort of decided this one. And I think that this is important that we fulfill Congress's mandate. To the question of whether we'll find comparability with foreign regulators, I actually share Commissioner Summers' view that we've had a long history of addressing ourselves to mutual understanding arrangements and finding comparable regimes where we can. We are, as Commissioner Summers notes, a small agency and need to leverage off of those foreign jurisdictions where we can. But I think domestically, I think Congress kind of decided this one, and I think Congress was right. I'm going to turn it to other commissioners. I'm going to support this rule and have a longer statement for the record.
Thank you. Good morning. I guess following along the same theme, if we would have just stuck with what the statute said, we actually might be in a good place here.
Avenues of conflicts in these areas under these products.
But derivative, the word derivative doesn't actually include commodity, right?
It does not, as in a physical commodity? No, it does not. It includes futures products on commodities.
My question would be, if the research arm of a swap dealer predicts that the price of the NYMEX WTI contract will reach X number of dollars by a certain date, that would be covered because that's a futures. But would a similar prediction about the price of an underlying commodity in the cash market, would that qualify as a research report?
To be clear, I mean, excuse me, certainly our rules don't trump the statutory language, so to the extent that there was any concern that research relating to the underlying commodity would not be covered, it certainly is under Section 40C of the Commodity Exchange Act.
So commodity is covered because that's what's in the statute, even though that's not what the rule says.
Correct. It's a statutory requirement. Correct.
It's very unclear. because it's not included in the definition. So it's very unclear as to what that covers. My next question is with regard to the walls we're erecting on the communications between the trading and clearing units. And I'm trying to figure out what we're trying to get at, because the way it's written in the rule, it's a little bit different for FCMs and IBs and for SDs and MSPs. So we have an exception for communications necessary to manage a default. But the way it's written in the FCM and IB portion of the rule, we prohibit them conditioning or tying the provision of trading services upon or to the provision of clearing services, or for an SD or MSP to otherwise participate in the provision of clearing services by improperly incentivizing or encouraging the use of an affiliated futures commission merchant. What are we trying to prohibit? What is improperly incentivizing?
The rule is attempting to prohibit, well, let's put it this way. The rule is attempting to make sure that the decisions of an affiliated FCM are made under their own, are made on their own.
So is it a violation of the rule to the tie and bundle? Is it a violation of the rule if the pricing of trading or clearing is tied together, so that if you say to a customer, this is the price if you trade and clear with us, and this is the price if you just trade with us?
The rule is directed at the business trading unit of an affiliated swap dealer or major swap participant. So it is only those personnel of the affiliated swap dealer that are prohibited from engaging in this activity. So it is a very narrowly defined business trading unit, those involved in pricing and marketing and soliciting and sales, and those supervising the performance of those activities. All other employees or personnel of the swap dealer are not prohibited from participating in the provision of clearing services.
I think my confusion mostly stems from the fact that this is prohibited, that the business trading unit of an affiliated swap dealer or major swap participant, this prohibition is in actually the FCM IB portion of the rule. But if you go to the the SD MSP portion of the rule, there are a number of other prohibitions with regard to the clearing unit of the affiliated clearing member of a DCO, and they're prohibited from a number of other things, but this would just go to the business unit of the swap dealer, or business trading unit, business trading unit of the affiliated swap dealer or MSP. It just is really unclear to me what we're trying to accomplish, and whether or not something that I think is probably a standard business practice with regard to the kinds of fees you charge to customers and what kind of business they do with you, if that's a violation of this rule, to be able to bundle those services.
The prohibition is on an influence or interference with the decision to provide clearing services or access to clearing. So as long as that decision is independent of the business trading unit of the swap dealer or major swap participant, it would not be a violation.
Okay. My last question is with regard to the record keeping for oral and written communications. The rule requires that swap dealers and MSPs keep records of all oral and written communications concerning quotes, solicitations, bids, offers, instructions, trading, and prices that lead to the execution of a swap, and that these records must be searchable by transaction and counterparty. Some of the commenters let us know that the traders typically engage in ongoing dialogue with counterparties over an extended period of time. and that it may be difficult to identify which communications actually lead to a single trade. So I'm wondering if you can explain for us what obligations swap dealers and MSPs have with regard to how these transactions can actually, in the end, be searchable by counterparty and transaction.
The obligation to keep the records by counterparty is in the statute itself, so we don't have discretion to change that. But the idea here is that all of these things would be recorded, and then if requested if a request for the audit trail or request for the daily trading records pertaining to a particular counterparty or to a particular transaction, that the SD or the MSP would have internal systems in place necessary to produce those records as required.
And you assume that when things like LEIs are implemented, it will be a lot easier for people to have systems that are searchable by counterparty, because presumably every counterparty will have some sort of LEI, right? So that...
Yes, the assumption is that those universal identifiers for swaps, for entities, and for particular transactions or products will greatly assist in doing this.
But will these rules and these obligations be tied to the implementation of those rules for
That would
data
be-
record keeping?
Those would be covered in the swap data reporting and record-keeping rules that were finalized in January. To the extent the identifiers come into use, then they would be required to be used for reporting to an SDR. Because this rule requires that a record be kept of what's reported to an SDR,
Right.
then these would be in the records as well.
My concern with regard to a lot of these record-keeping requirements, as you know, is because of the way the conforming amendments took up some of these requirements for FCMs and IBs in the futures context, and for what kind of requirements will be imposed on those market participants versus what we're doing in the swaps world, and whether or not this even is applicable in those sorts of situations. So I hope that we're sensitive to that when it comes to the conforming amendments of these particular provisions.
Thank you, Commissioner Summers. Let me just say, on the conforming amendments, we've gotten a lot of comments on a particular aspect. If I recall, it relates to members of designated contract markets and recording and record keeping. And yeah, I think I share your concern that we have to address that and dial some of that back in the conforming amendments. So, Commissioner Chilton.
Thanks for the work, guys. Did a good job. A couple of clarifying questions. Does this rule make clear who is responsible in an organization for the protection of segregated customer funds?
The Chief Compliance Officer rule covers this, not specifically, but more generally, that the Chief Compliance Officer is responsible for administering the compliance policies reasonably designed to ensure compliance with the CEA and Commission regulations. To the extent that there is a segregation requirement in the rules or in the statute, then the Chief Compliance Officer has an affirmative obligation to take reasonable steps to ensure compliance with those rules.
And does it further require, this rule, that there are intraday checks that are supposed to go on to make sure that rules aren't being prohibited, whether or not it's segregated funds or whether or not it's position limits? But this isn't just at the end of the day or the beginning of the day, but this is an intraday accountability thing for the firms, correct?
To the extent segregation is required at any time during the day, they would have to have policy.
Well, it is required during any
Right.
time of the day.
During the day, the policies and procedures for compliance with that requirement would have to account for intraday checks and balances to make sure that that is the case.
Intraday, all right. And now this issue of, the firewalls between, which I think you've struck a good balance. Matter of fact, let me just ask this first. Do you think you've struck a good balance of, not just for yourself, obviously you're coming forward with a rule, but of the comments that we received looking at all of them, do you think that the rule reflects a balance? Or, I mean, look, we can adopt anything that we can get 3 votes on. But do you think of the comments received that this rule presents a balanced approach to what they said?
We do. We received many, many comments on this particular issue on both sides, many of which asked for even stronger firewalls between clearing and trading, including comments asking for physical separation of these entities into different buildings. We did not go quite that far. We did respond to legitimate concerns about default management and those types of things, but I think we've struck an appropriate balance here between amongst the commenters.
Okay. And we have done everything that is required under the financial reform law.
We did.
Okay. So my last area is this issue of firewalls between clearing and research and trading, interdependently there. But so if you're a trader and maybe you don't know a lot about the palladium market, but one of your customers wants you to be in palladium or whatever it is. There's no prohibition against your trading arm having some researchers or some people that can give expert advice, correct? The prohibition is between the research arm of the firm and the trading unit. Do I have that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
To the extent that a trading desk is creating its own research and is presenting that to counterparties or the public, as long as it's clearly delineated as the product of a trading desk and is basically in the form of research that's part of a solicitation for business, that would be permitted.
See, one of the concerns, and some of us talked about this for years, going back to 2008 even, where some of these research arms are very successful, they're prominent, people look at them, they use those like they're leading economic indicators. So we had in 2008, as crude oil was skyrocketing, one of these research arms came out and said crude oil is going to be $200 a barrel. And everybody is saying, well, before they published the research, did these guys, the researchers, go tell the traders, by the way, we're going to do this, it may move the market? Now, they would say no, and they say, well, no, we have our internal firewalls, but that doesn't mean they're not, in the cafeteria line together, saying, tomorrow, watch out. It can have an impact. And by the way, these trading arms, they're self-funding a lot of times. They make money because people subscribe to their services. I'm not criticizing them. They're very smart folks, and they do a lot of good for markets in general. But what we're doing is saying that you can't have this, as I say, sort of an insidious relationship, and we do have firewalls. These are firewalls that we sort of use a lot of times anyway. If 3 of us are about to get in an elevator, we want to make sure there's an attorney with us to make sure we don't discuss business. So we're really asking for something that government does now. We're asking for something that is done other places in business, and I commend you for all your work, and thank you, and I support the rule.
Commissioner Chilton, it actually comes out of the Joint Harmonization Report when the President in 2009 asked this commission to work with the Securities and Exchange Commission on looking at all our rules and seeing where we could have some similarities. One of the recommendations that Congress then took up is that we have some of these firewalls between research and trading similar to what's in the securities field. So that's where you may have been ahead of that in 2008, but I'm saying the President and others joined you in 2009 maybe.
He doesn't often listen to me and take my advice, but I appreciate the thought of it.
Commissioner Maya.
I'd like to follow up on a question Commissioner Summers raised regarding technology. The rule requires that all information necessary to conduct a comprehensive and accurate trade reconstruction of each swap include being searchable by transaction and counterparty. Can you tell me what vendors offer this package and would allow swap dealers to instantly make all phone calls and emails or chats searchable by trader or transaction? Do you know who offers this today, and is it installed?
There are a number of vendors that have consolidated voice recording and data recording, as we understand. But
will
whether
it
or not
achieve
it's,
exactly what to make simultaneous, the conversation associated with all the trade data, et cetera, to make sure that this is a seamless, searchable by both counterparty and transaction.
Yeah, I do not know.
So I suspect you don't know how much it's going to cost.
I don't.
What is the time frame when the dealers are supposed to have this possible system in place?
All of the rules the compliance dates for all of the rules are keyed on the completion of both the entity's definition and the product's definition. Other than that, there is a staggered compliance regime in the adopting release that has compliance dates that are dependent on whether or not the SD or MSP or the FCM or their IB has been previously regulated. So to the extent that there is an SD or an MSP that has not been previously regulated, they will have a longer time to comply with all of these rules in various.
But it still doesn't solve the problem. If the technology is not available, we still require it. We didn't offer any leniency for technological consideration.
Well, let me that's a very good question. Some people were talking to us yesterday, so excuse me, it's real quick, but to follow up on that. We have general authority, do we not, that would allow us to issue an order if the technology is there. Certainly, if the technology is not there, certainly we shouldn't be requiring it, or we should be able to make a provision so that people aren't put in between a rock and a hard place. But we have general authority. I'd like to go back to your
original point, though. If the technology is not there, we shouldn't be requiring it, which is exactly right. We can waive it later. If I get that we're good at that. But the question is it available today, and are we mandating something today?
Ms. Josephson.
I mean, we didn't even ask the question.
I just say,
It's our understanding that there is technology available. We're not sure of all of the bits and pieces with that, but with respect to the requirements, to make clear, the separately identifiable with each swap transaction, that is actually a statutory requirement, not something that we are putting forward in the rule independently. It's already been set forth by Congress.
But the searchable element of that, you have set the bar extraordinarily high. I get that it requires us to keep the data. Some of my later questions will ask the question, why don't we just allow them to keep the data at the SDR? That was an option too. It doesn't say they have to keep it at the firm. Why not keep it at the SDR? They will have LEIs. They'll have it all separate. But now we've got redundant sets of books. And that's my frustration with this cost-benefit analysis. We don't care. It didn't seem to – we just rejected it out of hand as not costly. And I'm trying to understand how costly is this technology, or if it even exists. I don't doubt that it will exist at some point, but we're mandating it today at a point where it doesn't exist that I'm aware of, and you guys aren't sure either. So that's my frustration. Do you, in developing your cost-benefit analysis, did you estimate the total cost, the cumulative cost of 4S, F, and G? What did that requirement cost us for storing the?
At the proposal stage, we requested comment and quantitative data on that. To the extent that we received quantitative data, we've taken that into account in the cost-benefit analysis. But what the total cost of it is, given the different sizes and implementation of the projected community of swap dealers and major swap participants, we were unable to quantify that in the cost-benefit analysis.
There was some discussion about the LEI, and the LEI is on track. That's clear from our data rule and some of these other things, and that's great news. But that only identifies the entity. The UPI really is the thing from a risk management standpoint that brings together similar swaps that would give you a better risk profile of understanding what swaps are. That is a long way off. How does that figure into any of your concerns here, or any of your mandates? Did you consider when the UPI, I mean, it's years away.
We did not consider the UPI in formulating these rules.
Commissioner Summers made a great point about substituted compliance. The statutory provisions, preamble, and the rule text presume that some percentage of SDs, MSPs, and possibly IBs will have a prudential regulator other than the CFTC. Nevertheless, the final rules do not permit substituted compliance, and in at least one instance specifically prohibits it. Is that correct?
Does not prohibit it if you're talking about the business continuity and disaster recovery. Just merely requires that any business continuity and disaster recovery plan that may be implemented in response to a prudential regulator or another regulator's requirements, that it be examined to make sure that it complies with this rule as well.
What is the rationale behind not providing such compliance in the regulations where regulations of a prudential regulator at issue may be demonstrably comparable?
I think the reasoning was that because the 4S requirements for capital and margin require that the prudential regulators set those for entities that fall under their jurisdiction, but not for any of the others, that it was assumed that the Commission would promulgate these rules on so that all entities are regulated under a consistent regulatory regime.
But if the other entities, other prudential regulators are consistent, what options do we have to maybe reduce the burden on?
Well, to the extent that they're consistent, so if you're an entity that has a prudential regulator and what's required by that regulator and these rules is consistent, then there's no duplication.
The statute requires SDs and MSPs to maintain a complete audit trail for conducting comprehensive and accurate trade reconstructions. This requirement is echoed in Regulation 23202A. What data elements are necessary for the audit trail to enable a trade reconstruction?
We believe that would be all of the pre-execution trade information that's listed, all of the execution trade information, and all of the post-execution information.
So that's all of the conversations that lead up to
Execution.
any negotiations,
Right.
months, weeks, days ahead, which is telephone, email, all of that.
That is correct.
Okay. And put into our technology system. How will you reconstruct an audit trail for a bespoke transaction?
Again, it would be all of the pre-execution trade information, the execution information, and the post-execution information should show the lead up to the execution, at the time of execution, what the terms of the deal are, and then anything that happens to that particular transaction post-execution as far as changes in terms, novations to other counterparties, those types of things.
Won't most of this stuff be stored at the SDR?
Some of this may be stored at the SDR. The pre-execution trade information will not be.
How do we deal with potentially small dealers, the little guys that are farm co-ops, et cetera? Do we make any waivers for them in terms of collecting and maintaining all this from a technology standpoint?
The record-keeping rules are consistent across all entities of all sizes.
One size fits all.
One size fits all.
All right. Under 4SJ, SDs and MSPs are required to establish a robust and professional risk management system adequate for managing the day-to-day business of the MSP and SD. We have interpreted this goal to require several pages of prescriptive rules requiring a host of policies and procedures, especially regarding the business trading unit. What is the goal of to be obtained by prescribing the SDs and MSPs to have at a minimum policies and procedures covering all 10 areas? Why didn't we just go with the statute and say policies and procedures are adequate and we'll work with you? We're very prescriptive in this area. What was the necessity for that? Because the statute isn't.
Especially for swap dealers and major swap participants that have not been regulated in the past, it was thought that having a better roadmap to compliance with the robust and professional standard would be the better way to go. All of these provisions in the risk management program were gleaned from existing risk management guidance and or rules from prudential regulators and other market regulators.
So we have discretion when it comes to the statutory language. Even though it is statutory language, we have leeway in executing it.
This is what is being presented today is the view that this is a robust and professional risk management program.
Let's turn to HFTs then. In that regard, we just said trading programs must have policies and procedures. We were not prescriptive in that regard. Why did we take a different approach in that regard?
Any future rules surrounding that area would of course be more prescriptive. In this sense, at the time of formulating the proposal, it was thought to be enough to have just required the policies, risk management policies and procedures around the review, testing, and use of these programs.
But we didn't say what testing, it just said, let's walk through it so everybody can keep up here. Can you describe what the HFT requirement is? Or I guess you call it, I think we've adjusted it to be trading, what do we call it now? Trading programs?
Use of a trading program would be subject, the swap dealer or major swap participant would be required to have risk management policies, written risk management policies and procedures that lay out how they test these programs, how they review the performance of these programs, how they risk manage the use of the programs.
When you say trading program, you're not talking about a trading desk. You're talking about a specific software system, right?
This originally, as proposed, was referred to algorithmic trading programs. It was thought that may be too restrictive. It didn't quite describe what.
But it's where we are today, though, not previously. Where we are today
Right.
is trading programs meaning software.
Meaning a systematic program of some sort, whether run by software or not. I don't think it would be limited to just software programs.
Okay. By having this in place, having these risk management procedures, would that have stopped the May 6th flash crash?
I do not know.
If industry were to adopt a set of best practices around this trading program standards, and frankly, we've touched on it in the technology committee. We established a report on this on pre-trade functionality. Would such practices meet the requirements of 23.600 D9 if they are incorporated and said best practices in their written policies and procedure? I mean, would that satisfy this, or does the industry have to wait for us to do another rulemaking in order to understand where the safe harbors are?
Under this rule, they would develop internal policies and procedures that meet the requirement for testing and review and the other.
But my
sections
point is,
of that.
what is the requirement for testing and review? If the industry says these are best practices, is that sufficient, or do we have to actively do something else to make sure that they understand what those standards are, or else it continues to be a gray area?
I would think you would have to set standards.
We need to act again to set standards.
Yes.
Is that what you said? All right. Can you explain where you set the baseline for comparison of the costs and benefits of these rules, and what analysis was used on all of this? What is the baseline?
Based on Section 15 of the CEA, the baseline is based on action of the Commission, the cost and benefits of actions of the Commission. So to the extent that a cost or a benefit is attributable to the act of Congress and not the Commission, that is the baseline.
So the baseline is post-Dodd-Frank, essentially. Let me just read the preamble. We'll quote it. To the extent that the new regulations reflect the statutory requirements of the Dodd-Frank Act, they will not create costs and benefits beyond those resulting from Congress's statutory mandate in Dodd-Frank. However, To the extent that the new regulations reflect the Commission's own determinations regarding implementation of the Dodd-Frank Act provisions, such Commission determinations may result in other costs. It is these other costs and benefits resulting from the Commission's own determinations pursuant to, in accordance with the Dodd-Frank Act, that the Commission considers with respect to Section 15A. So it sounds like that language means if Congress mandated it, that's the baseline. If we did something beyond that, that's only the additional stuff beyond the Dodd-Frank Act is something that we would have to consider. Is that a fair characterization?
That's correct. Actually, not only pre-existing actions by Congress, but also any pre-existing actions that the Commission has taken with respect to existing rules that are already in place. Section 15A requires that the Commission consider the costs and benefits of the action of the Commission. And here with the rule proposed before you today, that is the Commission action. And the cost-benefit consideration section of the release goes through, again, a consideration of the costs and benefits of this action. So to the extent that an action of Congress imposed certain statutory requirements on registrants or others, or to the extent that there are already pre-existing Commission regulations that, say in Part 1, for instance, where there are already requirements based on a prior Commission action, those would not be factored into the cost-benefit considerations under 15A. It's just the action that's being taken here today, or under consideration by you today.
Why the OMB Circular A4 says that we're supposed to use the baseline approach being pre-statutory action. Why isn't that not? Why did we ignore that? That's a sign, Dan. Sit down.
Okay, I won't speak. Generally speaking, what Ward and Frank have said is correct in terms of our general approach and our interpretation of 15A, that 15A requires us to consider the actions of the Commission. This is a Commission decision, and not to reweigh the congressional action. That's a separate question. It's not necessarily the same question as what is the baseline for doing that comparison. The language that you referred to in this cost benefit is we've taken this approach generally to our rules because it is our interpretation of 15A that we consider the costs and benefits of the Commission's actions and not reweigh Congress. Constructing the baseline really goes to what's the reference against which we weigh those costs. Sometimes, and it depends on the particular rule, sometimes the baseline of necessity will include the entire requirement, and then we measure the alternatives before the Commission considering those costs, and sometimes, it depends on the particular circumstances, it'll be, as you've said, assuming that those costs are already there, what's the incremental additional cost? It really will depend on the factual circumstances in the particular rule at issue, what the baseline we adopted. That's consistent, we believe, and this is what we attempted to address in our guidance. We believe that's consistent with the A4 guidance as to how you develop a baseline. But the baseline is really for how you consider the cost. Sometimes, as I said, it will include the congressional mandate and sometimes it won't. But in terms of weighing the alternatives, we don't reweigh what the costs and benefits what Congress has already done. And each baseline will be determined in the context of a particular rule. OGC, OCE will work with the team to develop the appropriate baseline.
I think I'm having an only in Washington moment. Only in Washington could we come up with a baseline that doesn't consider where we are today, but considers a post-statutory change. The baseline, for economic analysis, a baseline is where we are today compared to where we're mandating the change to be. Whether it's Congress or us, you have to show the difference in where we are today to where we're going. And we just don't. And that's frustrating to me. And it's got to be frustrating to everybody who has to pay for that change in cost, because I don't think they care whether it was Congress that mandated it or the discretionary difference that we mandated based on congressional action. The fact is they have to install technology systems that are expensive and may not even exist today in order to comply with our rules. They don't get to say, oh, my baseline, oh, it's post-Dodd-Frank, oh, I shouldn't complain so much about it. The reality is you have to look at it, you should look at it from a pre-Dodd-Frank analysis. Where in 15A does it say the terms reasonably feasible? And what do those words mean?
Well, what we have done is interpreting 15A and the requirement, and as well as there are three basic statutory provisions that statutes that govern our rulemakings. There's the Dodd-Frank, which is the requirement, and now part of the Commodity Exchange Act. There's 15A, basically the underlying cost benefit, and then
From the CEA.
from the CEA.
Yeah.
So it's really both the CEA, and then there's the Administrative Procedure Act, and it's both what the Administrative Procedure Act requires in terms of reasoned decision making, as applied to the underlying statutory requirements that we're interpreting here and giving meaning to. The reasonably feasible is our guidance in terms of looking at the judicial precedent, what the courts will look to in terms of agencies and reasoned decision-making and applying statutes and the Administrative Procedure Act. And so that's where
Does
our
reasonably
guidance-
feasible appear in the APA?
I believe reasonably feasible, I don't have it in front of me, I believe that reasonably feasible comes out of the case law applying
Okay.
these
Does it have any
requirements.
relationship to financial resources? That if it's just too difficult for us to look or expensive, we just are excused from looking?
Well, I wouldn't say, I think that the case law generally interpreting what agencies are required to do in terms of reasoned decision-making indicates that agencies can only do what's reasonably feasible of agencies, that technical perfection is not required, that certainty is not always required. The agencies are given a charge by Congress, basically the case law, and the courts will say, did the agency do a reasonable job in applying these requirements? Certainty and absolute perfection is never required.
Would you think it would be reasonably feasible to call a technology company to find out if what we're mandating is actually available?
Well, it would depend, what's reasonably feasible obviously will depend upon the precise circumstances at issue there.
I'd like to go back to the SDR question. Thank you, Dan. And we were confronted with a decision of, are we going to, for these SDs and MSPs to rely on the SDRs to meet the record-keeping obligations? And we made the decision, no, we want redundant books and records. We want everything to go to the SDR, but we also want SDs, MSPs to keep everything, so a complete duplicate of everything that we're mandating be sent to the SDR. Now, what's astounding, and I raised this in my opening statement, is that in the cost-benefit analysis, states that it's premature to permit SDs and MSPs to rely solely on SDRs to meet the record-keeping because they have no track record of operations. Yet we've published hundreds of pages of very specific and detailed rules mandating exactly what we want to see. Why do we contradict the effectiveness and the use of these things when we've created this regulatory Frankenstein and now we're not going to use it?
Well, there are two reasons stated in the preamble. One is that they need this information for their own risk management purposes, their own internal purposes. And an SDR is not going to have all of this information. It's limited to some fields, but not all fields, or some information, but not all information. And again, because SDRs have no track record at this point.
What fields are we missing that they're not going to have? I'm not sure what data and it doesn't discuss it in the preamble, so I'm not sure what we're missing. I get the pre-trade stuff.
Right.
The pre-trade execution, that we're going to mandate that in your technology system. But you can set that aside. But why would we want two books? How are we going to enforce two sets of books? What are we supposed to do with that? running back and forth between two entities to reconcile? Is that our job? Do we have the resources for that? Why don't we just, everybody agree to keep one set of books and we all agree that it's in the SDR? Then we have it. I mean, we regulate the SDR. We see it. We can get any piece of data we want at any point. And they'll be using the same data we're using. Why would we want to be caught in this dual? And how much is it going to cost to keep another set of books?
Commissioner Malia, can I answer a little bit on just
Give it a shot.
Well, because a swap dealer has a set of books that is not at the SDR, the general ledger and subledgers that keeps all of their transactions, which is important to risk management. Their daily mark-to-markets, their daily risk management, which is involved in monitoring not just the risk, but the profits and loss of that entity by trader, by desk. That, in fact, is what they do now. The swap data repository
But won't all that data be in? Why won't all that data be in the SDR?
Actually, all that data wouldn't be in there. Beyond the pre-trade that you rightly point out, that the orders and the conversations, that's not at the SDR. But actually, the profit and loss and the risk management that goes around that
Well, let me just
is in a general ledger and subledgers, which, I mean, most swap dealers or soon-to-be swap dealers already keep, because that's part of prudent risk management, is to keep books and records and subledgers on your transactions.
Well, then why didn't we cost that out? We had that option to determine, and let me just make one final point, because it doesn't cost it out here. We just ignore it and say, you know, inconsistent with the OMB guidance, which requires us to look at alternatives and price them. We ignored that and we just said no, even though entities said it was going to be expensive. The keeping of the books concern is, I know you're not following this, but everybody now knows that that MF Global's books were a disaster. So I'm not so sure that raises my confidence. But if we have one
But the swap data repository is not keeping, nor have we required them to do the old thing of debits and credits and actual subledgers and general ledgers. We've not. We've just said it's an important regulatory tool, absolutely, the swap data repository, but it's not keeping the records of a general ledger, profits, losses, risk management. That
I don't think anybody was asking to get out of that. They were saying, all the trades that you're going to see, that let's agree to use the SDR for those set of trades. And we said no.
Because how a trade is entered into a general ledger or into a subledger in an actual dealer is different than the information that's over at the swap data repository.
Well, I think we should have done a more robust job to answer the concerns of the market, and done the proper analysis required by the OMB Circular A4 to evaluate the costs of this decision, and then actually explore whether this is option. We just ignored out of hand in this document.
No, I know we have differences. I think we have done the analysis that's proper under 15A, the Commodity Exchange
Act. There's no analysis. I mean, let's find out what kind of analysis. This is a major rule, according to OMB, according to the OIRA rules under the Congressional Research Act. It apparently is $100 million of economic impact. How does that $100 million annually break out in this rule? What makes up $100 million?
It's not, first of all, it's not an annual, it's an aggregate impact.
It says in the OIRA thing, it says annual.
Well, we have not broken down as far as specific, from a numerical standpoint, what the costs and what the benefits are of this particular rule. I think there's an expectation with respect to, again, not just the costs that would be inherent in putting together these systems, but also the benefits that are to be derived from having robust risk management, record keeping and reporting, and all the other requirements set forth in this rule before you.
So we didn't run the numbers. So is the $100 million a net number or a gross number in terms of costs?
Gross.
And it said it may,
If I may, I'm
Maybe
sorry,
an
it's
annual.
gross costs and benefits. So it's not net of the two. It's what are the costs, what are the benefits, what is the gross of
how
those two
much were the
numbers?
benefits?
I'm sorry?
How much were the benefits?
Again, we have not numerically broken this down.
All right. I'm sorry to be so tough on you on this one. I'm very frustrated that with our cost-benefit analysis, as you can tell. I don't mean to take it out on you. I know you guys have worked very hard and tried to answer all my questions, and I appreciate that. And I'm sorry if you detect tone. Sorry.
Thank you, Commissioner Mayor. Can I just, before we turn to Commissioner Weegan, I just want to ask David Meister, who's the head of our Division of Enforcement, a question which goes to one of the questions that Commissioner Malia was reviewing, is searchability of voice records. Just as you're the head of Division of Enforcement, how searchable are voice records? What do you know about technology and the search of voice records and so forth?
Sure.
Hey, before you answer that, I'm fully aware that you can search voice records after the fact. The question is, how do you put them together during the transaction? And that's what my concern is. This assumes that magically all of this stuff turns into searchable by trade and transaction. How does that happen? I get it that you can go after the fact and review and start tagging stuff. I get that. That's a manpower issue because you have to go after the fact to do it. This doesn't distinguish. It says you must make this available. And I'm just trying to wonder if there was some magic technology out there at this point that would automatically allow you to tag as you're having a conversation which trade, what pre-trade trade and transaction does it associate with.
All right,
I assume afterwards you're just going to have to go back and piece this all together.
Right, so let's take it a question at a time, because you're raising a separate question, which might be for Frank, about whether it's simultaneous. But my question for David or anyone on the team is, how familiar are you with an ability to search voice recordings? Because we must be involved in this already.
Sure, there are software vendors that provide the ability to search digital audio recordings by words very effectively, as I understand it. As a matter of fact, a number of government agencies use these programs. I think the FTC, the Department of Defense, Homeland, have programs. I won't say the name of the program that's used a lot by the government, but you could do a search on the internet, which is what the internet's for, to Google that sort of capability.
Is that what this rule provides for?
I don't know. I'm just. You had asked what was the. I think you had asked what would be a vendor that could do that.
And I agree with you.
And the way it searches, Commissioner O'Malley, is it does it by sort of digitally, so that if, for example, if you wanted to search for the word, Meister in a tape, it will across, as I understand it, a huge volume of recording. It will do that and pull up all the times that Meister was mentioned over the past, long period of time. Pull out those recordings and the slice of those recordings so that they can be listened to.
Frank and Ward, do you want to answer? Is that adequate for this rule? That they can set aside a whole bunch of voice recordings and say that's sufficient? Because what they don't want to have is a visit from Meister to show up later and say, all right, I want to see all your transactions. Because it says to sort by trader. So is it allowed to say, all right, you can go look and here's our closet full of tapes, knock yourself out, go digitally sort it? Is that adequate? Is that what this rule provides, is what David just said?
Yes, that would be adequate. At the proposal stage, we had required that these be bundled into separate electronic files for each transaction and counterparty, and that was removed in this final stage.
And Frank, I'm suspecting Commissioner O'Malley would accept this amendment, but I would have to vote it here. Can you come up with language to clarify that what David just said is acceptable and put that in the preamble? I mean, it might not get you to vote for the whole rule, I know, but I mean, at least, because I think that's a very important exchange between David Meister and Frank and Commissioner O'Malley and myself that would be good to capture that that is acceptable.
Sure.
That that's what really this is about, this searchable
That you would
piece.
have to store these things and then they'd be searchable upon request.
Upon request, the way that Mr. Meister described.
Right.
And that includes email, that, all of that stuff you can store separately.
Right. By removing the requirement that it be stored in a separate electronic file, that's what we were doing in the finalization.
See, because what we did was we proposed, just to bring the public into this, we proposed that even the voice recordings had to be stored in separate electronic files, and a lot of commenters said that would be a burden, and we did take that into consideration and backed away from that and said, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to make a voice recording electronic, but you still have to be able to search it. And I think you've raised the question, well, what does it mean to search it? And I think what I'm hearing from Frank is it's upon request, and just clarifying that what, in essence, what David said is what that is meant to be. But I'm doing this a little improperly. I
I
probably have to make
propose
a
something?
motion and have a second and so
May I
forth.
propose something? Perhaps to the extent that the rule doesn't already cover what I'm talking about, it could be, the preamble could be clarified, just a suggestion.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying. is
I think
that
we have a
it-
different, I think it may be the difference in what the rule says and what the preamble says. And so it's got to be clear. And, you know, I look forward to reviewing the language.
Yeah, I would, so I'm going to add two pieces of this, if I might, and then you'll have questions. I'm just going to add something. That which was the exchange between Frank, David, Commissioner Malley, and me, that be clarified in the preamble, that it's about searchability along the key words of who the counterparty is, or key words of upon request. But I think it would also be worthwhile to have a delegation, similar to what we did in large trader reporting, but a delegation to the division director of DSIO, that if swap dealers are having, need more time, just like in large trader reporting, I think we delegated to the head of DMO 6 more months or something, but to allow more time on this searchability issue.
If I may, the preamble states, the Commission believes that this modification will make the requirement less burdensome for SDs and MSPs because it will allow such registrants to maintain searchable databases of the required records without the added cost and time needed to compile records into individual electronic files. So I think this is covered.
Commissioner Weegan? Or were you asking, you weren't asking me something I was going to?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Switching gears just a little bit here, I wanted to turn back to the section on conflicts. And there are some questions raised that were understandable. But my understanding of some of the changes made in the rule text, comparing the proposal to the final, was in fact to clarify things, not to make it less clear. And focusing for a moment on this, some of the language in the rule that deals with the conflicts between the trading business unit and the clearing unit, accepts clearing customers, or participate in any way with the provision of clearing services and activities by the Futures Commission merchant. So that's how the proposal read. Now looking at the final, it now reads, I'll just focus on that last clause. It now reads, or in any way condition or tie the provision of trading services upon or to the provision of clearing services, or otherwise participate in the provision of clearing services by improperly incentivizing or encouraging the use of the affiliated Futures Commission merchant. And then it goes on, but leaving that for now. So the question for the staff is, isn't it the case that, again, comparing how the proposal read with the final, aren't the operative words here improperly incentivizing or encouraging the use of the affiliated Futures Commission merchant, which now modifies participate, the words participate in the provision of clearing services.
Yes, we would agree with that statement, that this is a clarification of the original in the proposal that was participate in any way. We received many comments and questions on what exactly that meant, and have listened to those objections to the broad scope of that language, and it is now much more narrowly focused on improper participation influencing clearing decisions.
And I think this question has an obvious answer, but I mean, certainly we're not prohibiting a firm that has an affiliated trading business unit and a clearing unit from providing the two services that those two separate units provide, correct?
No, it would not.
Will you yield, Commissioner Wiegand?
Sure.
I don't understand what improperly incentivizing means, which was my question earlier. What is properly incentivizing versus improperly incentivizing? I don't get it.
I can take a stab at trying to answer that, but maybe you guys should start with an answer.
Again, this is only narrowly limited to the business trading unit, so it would be incentivizing through offering
Well, if I can interrupt, what I would say is that, again, the focus should be on the word improperly. It's not saying that there can be no incentivizing or encouraging necessarily. The focus is on proper. We're getting at improper conduct here, which is to say that the trading unit and the trading business unit and the clearing unit, they can decide how or at what price to offer their services to their customers. And the Commission is not trying to interfere with that. What we're trying to prevent is any improper behavior that might relate to pricing.
And as I stated earlier in response to your question, this is meant to maintain the independence of the decisions of the affiliated clearing member in offering clearing services, pricing their clearing services, accepting customers for clearing, to make sure that those decisions remain independent in order to ensure, to the extent practicable, that there is open access to clearing.
So I guess I would reiterate that I think what the staff was trying to do with this change is to in fact clarify things and not to muddy the waters. I hope that that's going to be the consensus view when folks have a chance to analyze the language. The other question I had related to the Chief Compliance Officer. You had mentioned that in the case of a registrant that has a board of directors, the Chief Compliance Officer would report directly to the board. And I believe the rule also says that if the registrant does not have a board, then it's the senior officer. Is that correct?
We followed the statutory construction, which is that they could report to either the board or to the senior officer. We did not further restrict that from the statutory requirement.
What if the compliance officer, though, works for an affiliate of a consolidated company, in which case who would be the senior officer, or who could be the senior officer?
It would be the senior officer or the board of the entity that is the registrant. So if the chief compliance officer, for whatever reason, is not an employee of the registrant, they would still be required to report to the board of the registrant or the senior officer of the registrant.
Okay. That's all I have.
Dave, before you call the roll, I have to do if I'm going to offer a motion and have some amendments, and unless I do it by unanimous consent on the first one, but my first one is I just want to make sure, Frank, are you, that I'd like to make sure that the clarity that you and David spoke to Commissioner Malia's last question be, that the public have that clearly in this preamble, that where we're talking about having records to search upon request, I mean, you know, because we'd have to request, is over these keywords, key terms, and so forth.
We'll clarify that.
Right, and so maybe I'm just asking without objection, unanimous consent to make that. That worked all right?
Yes.
And then, I don't know if I'm losing folks here, but I'd also, I might need a motion, I'll make the motion, that the head of DSIO be delegated, just as we've done in the large trader reporting thing, additional. You wouldn't want them to be able to give additional time?
I know we're looking at this. The question, I think, in my opinion, is why are we delegating it?
To give additional time?
That's what everybody's discussing. So if you could give us some more time on this. And I think another feature with this is to consider the cost of the project. You know, if it's technically not feasible, or if it is technically feasible.
To do this search, but this is this
Oh,
search.
that, I thought we were on to the next issue, this preamble language.
I was talking about this search thing.
The search thing I'm fine with.
I'm not sure what piece of paper you just raised.
I don't, something your staff handed around.
No,
so.
I didn't produce this. No. I don't know. That could be another commissioner that produced that. I don't know.
Who produced it?
Oh,
Oh, I'm sorry. Bart's. Commissioner Chilton.
yeah, but I didn't look at it. I mean, I don't know. If people don't like it, then let's not do it. I haven't. But they don't want to do this? I don't know. I like it's,
Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to take a short recess because it was Commissioner Chilton's document and he's not here. So why don't we take a 5 to 10 minute recess?
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, 1, 2.
think we're back in session. Can I ask a question of Frank as Commissioner Chilton's getting his, on the dialogue that you just had before we recessed with Commissioner Weegan and I think Commissioner Summers about improper or improperly, I think it'd be helpful to add some words to the preamble. You have to write them, but to make sure that people know what this, to clarify that improper is, as you said earlier, I think the transcript would show is a narrow thing. But do you want to tell us how you might be able to clarify? Maybe I could then ask unanimous consent that you write a sentence to clarify that.
We would add a footnote or another sentence to that part of the preamble to clarify that improper in this context means encouraging the use of an affiliated FCM that would wrongfully interfere or influence the decision by the FCM to provide clearing services and activities to a particular customer in violation of 1.71D1, which is the preceding section that has the general rule that an affiliated swap dealer MSP shall not interfere or influence the provision of clearing services or activities. So that the improper refers back to the previous section and only the interference or influence on the provision of clearing services or activities. We can,
in essence, that it doesn't mean something else. It's
no,
really
something else, right? Narrowly defined this.
I don't know if others think, but I mean, Commissioner Weegan, I think that would be helpful to narrow that.
I think it would be helpful to narrow, and just to be clear, the consent request is that we do something along these lines. We're not committing to that precise language. We need to work with the language a little bit.
Because I normally also ask consent to take technical corrections, but yes,
Yeah.
that's what I think it'd be helpful to clarify that improper is only really referencing back to, as you said, something like wrongfully influencing under whatever the rule text is, not something else that people have to guess about. So, all right, so unanimous consent. All right. I think that the recess was largely about an amendment that Commissioner Chilton and his staff had suggested on a delegation, basically addressing concerns that if a registrant needed more time because of it was technologically challenging, or there's words in this actual amendment about technological issues, including cost considerations for that particular registrant, that the director of the Division Swap and Intermediary Oversight could grant extensions of times for compliance with the daily trading records. I'm trying to shortchange, but that's what I understand. Do you want to offer your amendment?
Yes, you described it aptly. There would be a 30-day period in which once an entity petitioned the agency, we would have 30 days to respond to them, to consider whether or not they had these technological challenges. And as part of that, we would look at the cost. We'd consider the cost. This would in no way impact their registration with the National Futures Association. So it's a pretty concise and clear amendment, ultimately.
So you're making that motion on the piece of paper that you and Commissioner Chilton.
I move the amendment.
Commissioner, yeah.
Second.
Do we do it by roll call? I can't remember amendments.
You may do it by unanimous consent or by voice.
Why don't we see if by unanimous consent, Commissioner Chilton's amendment is seconded by Commissioner Amaya?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, aye.
We doing a roll call vote now?
Or no, I guess without objection is
Without
actually
objection.
what it is. All right. So now we have the staff recommendations with 2 preamble clarifications and Commissioner Chilton's amendment. Mr. Stawick.
Commissioner Weegan.
Aye.
Commissioner Weegan, aye. Commissioner O'Malley.
No.
Commissioner O'Malley, no. Commissioner Chilton?
Aye.
Commissioner Chilton, aye. Commissioner Summers?
No.
Commissioner Summers, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye. Mr. Chairman, on this question, the yeas are 3, the nays are 2.
The A's having it, the staff recommendation is accepted and will be sent to the Federal Register. Should I take unanimous consent on technical corrections now, too? Why don't I do unanimous consent on technical corrections, particularly given what we just said? Without objection, so moved. Thank you, Ward, Frank, Sarah, Cameo, Gary Barnett, and the many others who have worked on those rules. Thank you. I think it's now block time. As the team is coming up to the table, let me just introduce and welcome Carl Kennedy from the Office of General Counsel, George, where's George? George Pullen, Lynn Riggs, Rick Schultz of the Division of Market Oversight, Essen, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Onor?
Owner.
Owner, okay. From the Office of Chief Economist to present the proposed rule on block trading. So I hand it over to you all.
Okay. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you, Chairman Gensler, for the opportunity to present. Before I begin, I would like to thank each member of my team and former team members for their assistance in preparing the block trade proposal that we present to you today for your consideration and vote. To provide context, I would like to provide relevant background on why the Commission is now considering today's proposal. Section 727 of the Dodd-Frank Act created Section 2A13 of the Commodity Exchange Act. Section 2A13 requires that the Commission issue rules regarding the real-time public reporting of swap transaction and pricing data. This section also requires the Commission to do 3 things relevant to this proposal. First, specify criteria for determining what constitutes a large notional swap transaction or block trade for the purposes of applying time delays for public reporting of such transactions. Second, to ensure that the public dissemination of swap data does not reveal the identities or business transactions of swap counterparties. And most importantly, third, ensure market liquidity is not hampered. In December of 2010, the Commission published a real-time reporting proposal, which included a methodology that swap data repositories would set block sizes. The methodology provided that block sizes would be equal to the greater of a so-called social size multiple test and a distribution test. Both of those tests focused on the number of swap transactions or trades and would likely have resulted in only 5 to 1% of all swaps being treated as blocks. The real-time proposal also included a generalized approach for grouping swaps with similar characteristics. This approach did not provide much detail on how swaps would be grouped, however. Instead, the real-time proposal set out a few examples. The real-time proposal also set out a 15-minute time delay for swaps that are executed on a swap execution facility or designated contract market, and asked questions regarding the appropriate time delays for bilateral swaps. Finally, the real-time proposal included 2 requirements that SDRs protect the identities of swap counterparties. First, by limiting disclosure of the notional sizes of swap data, so that notional sizes above 250 million would be masked. And second, by including a general requirement tracking the statutory language of 2A13 that SDRs protect the identities of swap counterparties. In December of 2011, the Commission adopted as final the real-time rule in Part 43 of its regulations. In the final rule, the Commission provided several definitions relevant to today's proposal, including the definition of the terms asset class, block trade, appropriate minimum block size, among others. It also established a series of time delays for the public dissemination of swap data. It put forth a list of interim cap sizes that varied by asset class to mask the notional sizes of large swaps, and it excluded from public reporting certain commodity swaps because the publication of swap data detail relating to the geographic delivery locations for those swaps might reveal the identities of swap counterparties. Because the Commission has not yet established a block size methodology, all swaps will be treated like blocks and will be subject to time delays as set out in the final rule. Today's proposal picks up where the final rule left off. As the Chairman mentioned in his opening remarks, in drafting this proposal, the team was informed by and is responsive to comments received by commenters to the real-time proposal. In addition, we were able to collect and review relevant data for two asset classes, interest rates and credit.